You're listening to China Africa Talk.
Jambo, ni Bridget akikuletea kipindi kinachohusiana na China na Afrika.
Vous écoutez le dialogue sino-africain avec Bridget.
Everything China, everything Africa.
Olá, você está ouvindo China Africa Talk com Bridget.
سيداتي وسادتي مرحبا بكم في الحوار الصيني العربي مع بريدجيت.
South Africa and China have signed a framework trade and investment agreement. The China-Africa Economic Partnership Agreement, or CAPA, aims at expanding bilateral trade and facilitating greater two-way investment. The deal is expected to grant more South African products duty-free access to the Chinese market, while also encouraging increased Chinese investment into South Africa. It will be followed by further negotiations toward an early harvest agreement set to be concluded by the end of March, when a first batch of South African exports is expected to benefit from tariff-free treatment. South Africa already exports a range of agriculture products to China, including citrus fruits and rooibos tea. Officials say the new agreement could open opportunities for South African businesses seeking entry into the Chinese market, particularly across mining, agriculture, renewable energy, and technology. China is also expected to dispatch an inward buying mission to South Africa. So, what does the signing of the China-Africa Economic Partnership Agreement signal about how China and South Africa are prioritizing the growth of trade and investment ties, especially in the context of the current international economic environment? I'm now joined by Dr. Emmanuel Matambo, Research Director at the Center for China-Africa Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Matambo, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Bridget.
Dr. Matambo, can you tell us about the most concrete outcomes of Minister Park Tau's China visit, especially the China-Africa Economic Partnership Agreement?
It was quite important for Mr. Park Tau to go to China, and we have to put this in a broader context. Last year, he went to the United States, as well as you would remember that last year Donald Trump was on a tariff spree across the world, and South Africa was adversely impacted by that. So Minister Tau went to the United States to try and allay the fears, if not of Donald Trump, but at least the fears of American industry. But America has become such a place where the tentacles of the government seems to influence even some of the private investors. So to say, we've seen that it was also the case with Venezuela. So having not really succeeded to the extent that he hoped to succeed, it only made sense that South Africa would try to broaden the scope of the people who would be able to enhance trade relationships with it. So this particular visit of Mr. Park Tau to China made sense for two basic reasons. The first reason being what I've already outlined, the United States imposing these unilateral tariffs on South Africa, 30% since June. The second reason is that China has been South Africa's biggest trading partner for the last 15 years, and South Africa is also China's biggest trading partner on the African continent. So this particular visit made a lot of sense, and obviously we are going to go into the details of what happened there, but I was just laying the foundation of what informed that particular visit to China.
Okay. Could you share more light on the significance of the trade deal? How does this set a new stage of all-around and institutionalized economic and trade relations between the two sides, South Africa and China?
The trade deal is quite significant. It actually lays the foundation for the early harvest agreement, which will only come in March, which is next month. And that will be now when the duty-free access of South African exports to China will kick into gear. So the Economic Partnership for Shared Prosperity was setting up a foundation for that. This is going to be very significant for South Africa because, remember, since 2024, South Africa is being ruled under a coalition government of parties that were bitter enemies not so long ago.
Okay.
But what they will do at the end of the day is to have a government that cushions the adverse impact of American tariffs on South African exports. So this was significant for that particular reason, because in as much as the government in South Africa is a marriage of convenience, I think all the parties involved want to see a South Africa that is prosperous. So for China to come up with that particular deal there, and as we go along, we're going to talk about the fact that this deal is actually not only with South Africa, but with other African countries. It is very impacted. South Africa was actually singularly targeted by the United States on the African continent. Initially, it was Lesotho, and then after August last year, it was South Africa with 30%
Uh-huh.
tariffs, which were the biggest tariffs in sub-Saharan Africa that the United States imposed.
Yeah.
So that deal is significant for that particular factor, especially though for the motor production industry in South Africa that was adversely hit because those were some of the major exports that South Africans were taking to the United States. We talk about citrus fruits as well. And those particular industries were adversely hit by those. So this is what makes the economic partnership for shared prosperity all the more important.
What does the signing of the framework agreement signal about China and South Africa's prioritization of growing trade and investment relations, especially in the current international environment?
This particular trade deal is important because it encompasses a range of issues. And these issues, by the way, are not only confined to trade. Yes, we are looking at it as a trade deal, but it is also typical of what has been happening in the international system here. We have seen that since the advent of Brexit around 2016, the first election of Donald Trump in the same year, we have seen that the West has become so insular. It has closed in on itself.
Mhm.
That is why it has become even an enemy of certain principles that were actually of Western origin, the principles of international trade, the principles of immigration, the principles of international rules, the principles of multilateralism. These are the principles from which the West has been withdrawing from, even though they are the architects of this particular international order. So this is quite important for countries such as South Africa and countries such as China. We can also look at them as in the context of them being members of the BRICS. So the current international system is such that in the withdrawal of the West, generally speaking,
Mhm.
from multilateralism, will need certain members to recommit themselves to international law, to international order as well, because international order has seen issues such as elimination of smallpox. We have seen the international system under the rubric of the United Nations being impactfully involved in the elimination or the limitation of conflict. We have seen the international order under the rubric of the World Trade Organization setting the rules about trade and industry in the world. So it is quite important that China and South Africa recommit themselves to those particular ideals. What is even more important is the fact that countries such as Canada, if you saw what happened in Davos at the World Economic Forum, several weeks ago. You could see that, yes, in as much as the United States is becoming an economic nationalist country under Donald Trump, we saw that there was a pushback by the European Union. There was also a pushback by countries such as Canada. So if South Africa, China, the European Union, Canada can actually commit themselves to the rules of multilateral trade, then yes, this particular trade, it was a bilateral trade agreement between China and South Africa, but it has potential to actually have a global impact.
Okay. Dr. Matambo, what kinds of South African exports will be able to enter China under the proposed arrangement, and which key sectors are expected to benefit most? Maybe we'll begin with the kind of products that we'll be able to see now on the Chinese market, which I'm also curious to see maybe at the next CAETE or the next CIIE in China. What's your take on this?
Yes, I think the China Expo, I think it will be held in Shanghai later in the year, if I'm not mistaken, in
Yes,
November.
yes.
So that will actually offer a very good platform for South African products. Now, let us look at the actual products that might be able to benefit from that. First, we also have to look at the things that were shut out from the United States. We're looking at the citrus industry.
Okay.
That might actually benefit because those are some of the industries that were adversely hit by Donald Trump. And what I would want to see, though, is that apart from the traditional South African exports, which have been chromium and minerals to China, what I would want to see, though, is also an improvement in terms of automobile parts that
All
the
right.
South African industry is exporting to the United States because these were badly hit. So is China going to have a market for those products? That's another thing. Second one, obviously, is something that we here in South Africa are very much proud of: rooibos tea.
Oh, yes.
Exactly. That is something that is authentically South African. That is
Yeah.
something that we need to be very proud of, and we know the Chinese have a liking for tea. So That is another industry that we could be sending to China. Obviously, seafood, we have spoken about seafood from the Western Cape to China, so that is another market that we can explore. We are consoled in South Africa by the fact that, yes, in as much as the United States impacted us badly in those particular industries, the citrus fruits and the automobile industry, we can still count on markets such as Germany, which still remains, I think, South Africa's biggest trading partner in the European Union. And obviously, China, which has been the biggest partner of South Africa. So these are some of the things that South Africa would want to benefit from. And as an aside, I know this is now veering us from the discussion we're having.
Yeah, sure.
As an aside as well, I was also consoled by the fact that on the 23rd of January, I think, we operationalized a deal with South Korea in terms of South Korea importing South African table grapes. So there is a market out there that South Africa could benefit from, especially if the United States will continue its hostility towards the country, so to say.
You know, a lot of people, when we're looking at the sectors that are likely to benefit, you've given an indication there about citrus and stuff like that, which we see it's the agriculture sector that is likely to benefit maybe more. But at the same time, I would expect other sectors, like as you highlighted, manufacturing. Do you see any other sectors besides the agriculture sector benefiting from this deal, or maybe an increase in the agriculture sector?
Yes, indeed. We have already spoken about the agriculture sector,
Yeah.
so maybe I'm not going to belabor that point there. We can talk about South Africa's mineral industry capacity as well. So traditionally, South Africa has been exporting a lot of mineral resources, but these are mostly in the raw form itself. What I really liked about the deal is that it highlighted four main aspects to it. Trade cooperation was only one of those four aspects there. The second one was investment cooperation. Investment cooperation is where now the expo in November will become even increasingly important. We have seen that the Chinese are actually interested in industries such as sub-miller, for example, in South Africa. This is a brewery industry in South Africa.
Okay.
As a banking sector that is a world beater, it's a banking sector that can actually compete with the best banking sectors in the world. How is that going to trade the Chinese market? The third sector from which South Africa is always likely to benefit more from China rather than the other way is the new energy cooperation sector. We are kind of out of the woods when it comes to load shedding in South Africa, but we could still do better to improve our manufacturing capacity. The last one, obviously, is multilateral cooperation, which we have already spoken about when we were talking about how the West has been withdrawing from multilateral trade principles and all that kind of thing. So there is a vast array of potential that this deal is likely to unlock. But we also have to acknowledge, Bridget, that these trade deals have to come with skills transfer from China to the African continent. Because as long as there is not that skills transfer, the industries that are going to benefit the most are going to remain agriculture.
Oh, yes.
And then are going to remain, these are labor intensive. We have to make sure that for us to have value addition from China, we have to grow the skills that are going to make us to turn what we dig up from underground there into value addition. And I think deals such as this should enhance that. Not only we are laying much emphasis on duty-free exports to China, but how are we making sure that we are enhancing value addition through skills transfer and technology transfer as well?
Could you describe a bit more the trade flows between China and South Africa prior to this agreement? What drove them and what were South Africa's main exports then? Maybe if you can just dwell on that a bit more.
Well, South Africa's trade to China at the moment has been mostly in chromium ore.
Okay.
Yeah, it has been in copper, it has been in diamonds, and then obviously it has been in some seafood such as abalone, and then a very modest export of citrus as well. So you already see that most of these are in the raw mineral resource form.
Yeah.
But what we have been importing from China are things in the electrical industry, things in the energy industry, and automobiles. Automobiles have actually been growing appreciably in South Africa. Automobiles from China, that is. We have seen GWM, the manufacturers of Havau cars as well. If you are driving South African roads, you see a lot of Havau cars. BAIC is also growing its market on the South African shores. And BAIC is actually, if I'm not mistaken, it actually has a semi-knockdown capacity here in South Africa. So there is a production of IC cars, but obviously at a semi-knockdown level there. And this is quite understandable as well because China, I think in the last 1 year or so, overtook Japan as a major car manufacturer, exporter, or something like that. So that penetration was kind of understandable on the part of China. And obviously, we are looking at issues such as apparel and stuff like that. So there has been this exchange, but the exchange as it is at the moment could do better if it does not replicate
Yeah.
South Africa trade imbalances and asymmetries with the so-called traditional partners,
No.
because this has been happening. So how will the Chinese make sure that they do not replicate those imbalances by being more intentional in terms of enhancing South Africa's industry and in terms of exporting some of their manufacturing capacity to South Africa, by the way?
I wanted to actually hear from you, like if we flip the coin, because we've been talking a lot about how China will be importing from South Africa, but when we flip the coin, what new investment is South Africa looking to attract from China from this deal?
So there is actually a lot that South Africa wants to attract. In the automobile industry, China could actually benefit a lot by exporting some of its potential to South Africa for two reasons.
Okay.
The first is even more than trade. It's about political relations and it's about diplomacy as well, because we want a lot of capacity from China to be on the African continent. We want their technology to be on the African continent. So by China being intentional about it, that will actually present China in a very good light. Secondly, is the fact that South Africa has a very good trade relationship with the European Union when it comes to car manufacturing. So
Okay.
if these cars are actually manufactured on the African continent, then China might actually grow its
All right.
portfolio of car manufacturing export to China. So that is one sector that South Africa wants to benefit from China. The second sector, obviously, is investment cooperation. We have seen that in 2007, especially when the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China invested about 20%, that was huge. It was probably the biggest investment that China had made to Africa actually at that particular moment. So we would want to see more of that investment. The third one, an issue that I have already alluded to, energy. Energy. We cannot build our industry if we do not have energy. And these days we are trying to enhance our renewable energy capacity, which is kind of heartening actually if you look at Chinese companies such as Longyuan and State Grid being involved in the renewable energy sector. We are trying to lessen our dependency on coal-powered electricity on the African continent. We understand the adverse impacts that it has as well on the environment. But at the end of the day, value chain in areas such as Mpumalanga province that depend on coal. So there has to be a specific shift. How are we making sure that we are going to give people who have been dependent on coal a soft landing, so to say, as we try to diversify our energy portfolio? So those are just some of the industries that South Africa wants to benefit. The fourth one is now technology. South Africa has an alarming level of youth unemployment, especially. And if you look at Africa's young people, these are people who are actually very, very clued up, so to say,
Yeah.
when it comes to issues with technologies. They are interested in that. The penetration of cell phone technology in Africa is massive and staggering. So these are young people who want to be conversant with growing technologies. And China is a world beater when it comes to technology. It can compete with the best in the world out there. So these are just some of the things that South Africa wants to attract from China. I hope that this deal is going to give a lot of impetus, so to say, to those particular industries.
Dr. Matabu, you've given a lot of reference there to car manufacturing, and we know that Chinese car manufacturers have significantly increased their presence in South Africa. What do industry estimates show about their performance in the market, and how's this benefiting South Africa's local economy and employment?
So at the moment, there is a modest improvement, so to say. If I'm not mistaken, I think 2024, 2025, only about 20,000 units of BAIC were sold and only just about 18,000 units of GWM. So there is this modest kind of improvement on China's part. South Africa obviously needs to manufacture more. There was a reduction, I think, in 2024, slightly over 500,000 car units were sold, which was a reduction from more than 600,000 the year prior. So those are just some of the reductions that we have seen here. But there is a lot of potential for Chinese cars, and that potential is because a lot of Chinese cars have this, they might probably give you the same performance as the Japanese and German cars that we have been accustomed to, but at a more affordable rate.
I've been seeing even on Facebook when I, scroll and, you come across some reels that have got some very cheap prices for Chinese manufactured cars. And I'm thinking, is this real?
Yes, they are very much competitively priced. So that is what makes them very much attractive to South Africa. Another thing, by the way, in the long term, is the fact that the Chinese is actually trying to improve electric vehicle
Yes,
capacity.
yes.
And I think that is something that we should also look forward to in South Africa. So there are a lot of advantages to Chinese cars finding their way on South African roads.
Yeah, and in recent years, maybe this question probably should have asked earlier, but maybe even in comparison, in recent years, specialty agriculture products from Africa, including citrus from South Africa, have remained popular in the Chinese market. Could we say that the agriculture trade has become a new highlight of China-Africa cooperation?
Yes, indeed. So, in as much as mineral resources will give you quick turnarounds in terms of money, agriculture is actually something that we have kind of not really improved on because in some cases, maybe the returns might take longer and stuff like that.
Mm.
But it could actually be a new frontier for improved trade relations
Ah,
between Africa and China. We have seen that China has been penetrating the agricultural industry in countries such as, even in small countries such as the Gambia,
yeah, yeah.
in bigger economies such as Ghana, in bigger economies such as Kenya, and all that kind of thing. So, yes, I think there has to be an intentional commitment to make sure that agriculture is enhanced. And this is where now what Donald Trump was doing last year could actually be a blessing for South Africa in disguise. Because in as much as we were exporting our automobile past the United States, there was also a very big agricultural export portfolio to the United States. So China now is opening a new vista, so to say. The
Mm.
deal that I said about South Korea, for example, that deal was being negotiated for the last 20 years, which is staggering.
Ah,
And it's
okay.
a lot of talking. So some of these deals they have to be worked out. And South Africa has a lot of citrus fruits exports to export to countries such as China. So yes, I think in as much as the mineral industry will remain a dominant sector, agriculture is a low-hanging fruit.
Dr. Matabo, following China's commitment to offer zero tariff access to 53 African countries, South Africa is the 33rd African country to sign such a framework agreement with China. Is this part of the broader trend among countries seeking to mitigate the effects of the United States' hardline trade stance?
So yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, in that in the long term, the African continent wants to mitigate the adverse impact of the United States tariffs. No, in the sense that for many Africans, they think as if, or they hope actually, not they think, but they hope that what has been happening in the United States is only a craze that is going to die out with the end of the Trump administration in January 2029. Now, I say that
Mm.
because in as the United States today is antagonizing everyone, including its trade, its traditional allies such as Canada, by the way. In as much as it is antagonizing everyone, what we have to realize is that the United States still remains an indispensable economy in the world. It still remains the biggest economy. It still remains a very big importer of African trade. It is quite important that AGOA, the African Growth Opportunity Act, AGOA, was renewed, even though it was only renewed for a year, and South Africa cannot rest on its laurels, so
Yeah.
to say. But that is actually going to help African exporters that have been dependent on the United States. So these deals try to mitigate that, but in the long run, we should not deliberately try to antagonize or perpetually alienate the United States because, yes, it is that particular partner that the African continent needs.
Mm. And this year marks the beginning of China's 15th five-year plan, 2026 to 2030, during which time the country will continue to promote high-quality development and expand its level of openness. How might this create new opportunities for cooperation between China, South Africa, and the rest of Africa?
What is quite important to note is that since President Xi Jinping became president of China, he introduced an idea that what he called the new normal. The new normal was about China transforming itself into a service economy. It had always been a manufacturing economy. It was called the factory of the world for decades on
Yeah.
end.
Uh-huh.
But then as people's incomes increased in China, we saw that there was also an increase in terms of wage demands from Chinese workers. And we saw actually that there was, so to say, a relocation of certain industries, primary industries from China to Southeast Asia. So the next 5-year plan now shows that China has actually caught up with the fact that it is now becoming a modern industry. It is now becoming a modern economy that will look at issues such as technology, will look at issues such as service industries. So where Africa is going to benefit from that is that the African continent today finds itself where China was about 4 decades ago.
All right.
We have
Yes,
a young
yes.
population, we have a young population, we have a very big labor base, and we also have low wages in our industries. In South Africa, I think the minimum wage, I think in the home industry is about 30 rand per hour or something like that. So
Okay.
this gives China as Africa a lot of great potential. But how are we going to make sure that we compete with countries in the Southeast Asian region, for example, where China has been relocating some of its industry? So there is a lot of capacity, but we need to make China see that particular light to say, here is a continent with a readily available labor force. So please bring all your industries to the African continent. Make sure that you manufacture your goods from the African continent as you transfer your skills and technologies to the African continent. So there is a massive and massive and an untapped potential that Africa has, and that Africa could benefit from China.
To wind up our discussion, Dr. Matambo, South Africa is China's largest trading partner in Africa, while China remains South Africa's biggest global trading partner. How can both countries cooperate more effectively in trade while upholding their commitments at multilateral levels such as the United Nations and the G20?
One of the important things that happened in September 2024 when President Xi Jinping went to China was that he spoke quite frankly about the trade asymmetries and the trade deficit that South Africa was running with China. So that was a very good place to start, because then the Chinese could hear for themselves some of the blind spots, so to say, and some of the blemishes that influence South Africa's that are present in South Africa's trade relationship with China. So that was a good place to start, and that is actually going to give the two countries a lot of impetus to make sure that they realign themselves to a trade equation that will be authentically and genuinely mutually beneficial. So that was a good way to start.
Okay.
Another issue is what I've already emphasized. Let us not be perpetual importers of finished goods. But how are we going to alleviate? We're going to alleviate that by making sure that consequential trading partners such as China help to improve the skills capacity that South Africa has. That is going to help out at a multilateral level is obvious to see. South Africa and China are both members of the G20. South Africa and China are both members of the BRICS, and South Africa and China are both members of the World Trade Organization as well. So how will that help? To help more than in just trade. It will also help in terms of South Africa's commitment to a multilateral international system. We have seen that South Africa and China tend to generally pull together in the same direction when it comes to issues such as Russia's war against Ukraine. We have seen that South Africa and China were found themselves on the same side when it came to issues of Israel's war in Gaza, for example. So yes, in as much as there is trade capacity, there is also a multilateral level that should make sure that it brings China and South Africa to the same level, diplomatically speaking, and that level it should be something that is actually advantageous to the developing world. Because as we have seen, since the end of the Second World War, the world has been ruled by a multilateral order that we have come to accept, but this order was ruled by the West, but then the West is withdrawing from that multilateral order.
Yeah.
But in as much as it was a multilateral order that was created by the West,
Yeah.
some of its components are actually components that we have kind of, yes, willfully bought into because they are helpful.
Yeah.
The United Nations, the World Trade Organizations, these are organizations that have done a lot of good in the world despite their blemishes, obviously.
Dr. Matambo, it was great having this discussion with you. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot, and thanks for the kind invitation.
Listeners, you can subscribe to our online newsletter on CGTN or Substack to get more insights on China-Africa relations. Just search China-Africa Talk. For now, it's goodbye. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others. Post it on social media or leave a rating and review. Thanks again. See you next time.